Welcome to episode 12. In this episode, we are going to look at a testing strategy for code that does some API work. It actually isn't really Magento 2 specific, but because it's such a common question and it comes up a lot on the internet or in trainings, I felt it's maybe a good idea to cover it in a kata. So if you have any further questions, please, as always, let me know. But until then, I hope you enjoy the kata. Let's get started. The scenario for this kata is that we want to replace the customer's first name with an informal short name whenever it's rendered on the website. The tool that I've chosen to use is a round plugin for the customer view helper. Creating the plugin is not part of this kata. I've already done that. If you want to create the plugin in a TDD fashion, please check out episodes 2, 3, and 4. To get started, I would like to first briefly cover what's already in place, and then we can get started with the kata. The first class I would like to look into is the customer view helper. That is the class that builds the name of the customer as it is rendered on emails and different pages. The class name is Magento Customer Helper View and has this method getCustomerName. It takes the prefix and the first name and the middle name and the last name and the suffix to compose the name that it returns. This module now replaces the first name with a short name. For this purpose, I created a little round plugin. So this plugin is called around getCustomerName, and it gets the customer's first name, and then it gets a shortened version and sets it on the customer data model. And then it calls proceed, and after proceed completes, it sets the original first name back onto the customer model just to be safe. And of course there are tests for this, so here we have the tests. I don't want to go into too much detail here because they're not really part of this kata, but they pass, they're all green. So that's where we start. The API that we'll be using during this kata is much simpler than a real API, but it should illustrate nicely how I suggest approaching testing and API integrations. The idea is we'll be creating an implementation of this very simple interface because that's all there is at the moment. We'll have it return the first match the API result contains. If the API doesn't return any matching short names, then we'll just return the given first name, or if there's some error, we'll try just to return the first name too. So let's have a look at the API. Let's send it a request and see the response. Let's try curl. curl-s, and the endpoint is hypocorisms.vinaycop.com. Hypocorisms is just a fancy word for short name. I like piping it to JQ, a nice utility to make JSON more readable on the command line. This is what it looks like. Or of course, we can use the REST testing tool in PHP Storm. This is the request tab, here's the host, here's the path, and this is the response. This little button pretty prints JSON. So there's a whole bunch of crap being returned by the API that we're not interested in. The only part that really interests us is this here. We'll just ignore everything except data, hypocorisms, which contains the list of names. So how do we go about testing this? The trouble with testing APIs is that if we mock the API, the remote endpoint, then our test would still pass even if the API changes. And that would leave our production code in a broken state without our tests failing. On the other hand, if we don't mock the API, then we have the problem that our tests might fail just for some network outage, or maybe the REST API endpoint is undergoing maintenance, and we might think our code is broken even though it's fine. What I like doing is I like writing a test against the behavior of the external API so it confirms it behaves exactly how I expect it to behave. And then I can develop my code against that behavior. And if that behavior changes, the test will break. So every part of the API that I cover with those tests, I can then assume to be that way in my code. If I need a lot of different classes accessing the API, then of course it also makes sense to encapsulate the actual API access in a single adapter class. For this kata, I think this is not necessary. We just have this small shortened first name interface to implement. It's just a single method, so adding another adapter class to the API is overkill. Alright, let's get started by writing the tests that confirm the behavior of the API. So where do we put it? It's not a real unit test because it works with an external collaborator over the internet. On the other hand, it's also not an integration test because it doesn't need the Magento runtime to be initialized. Actually, it needs nothing from Magento. We're just sending some requests to the API and checking the return values. If I have many tests of this kind, I tend to create a new directory behavior within test and put them there. But for now, let's just put them into unit just so they run nice and quick. Okay, so this will be the hypocorisms API behavior test. And it extends PHP unit framework test case. I can't believe we're writing the first test 5 minutes into this Kata video. Test is this on. And this fail halt. Okay, let's run this. Yep, everything's wired up correctly. Okay, let's first check the API returns JSON. Test returns JSON. Okay, we want a response, and how about file get contents? Oops. Global scope file get contents, please. http hypocorisms dreadful word vinacop.com/names. Let's just use the empty endpoint, so like an empty name. So even with an empty name, I expect the response to be JSON. So let's do the following. JSON decode. Okay, now we can say this assert same, JSON error none, JSON last error. And let's have a descriptive message if something goes wrong. Maybe we need the result after all. Because if JSON decode fails, I would like to have the response as part of the message. JSON decode failed. JSON last error message. And a new line and the response. Ugh, this is getting a bit long. Let's move them into individual lines. Okay, time to run the test. And it works. It's always a good idea to see a test fail too, especially if it worked right from the start. So let's add a random character to the response so the decode fails. And yes, the test fails with a message JSON decode failed, syntax error, and here we can see the response. Very good. So good, this test works. Back to green. Okay, time to write the next test. Okay, what should be the next one? Let's do the next one about what happens if the API doesn't find a matching short name for the given name, so the response doesn't contain any short names. Test returns empty, array if no match. Let's extract the URL into a property, API URL maybe. That's good, so we can reuse it here. Okay, let's see. $result equals file get content. This API URL, not a name. And actually, let's decode that straight away. And let's have JSON decode return it as an array. Phew, okay. Now, we had this data sub-array. I would just like to have another peek how that actually looks. Okay. This data hypocorism sub-array is what we want. Okay, let's start like this. This assert internal type, array, result. And this array has key, data, result. Okay, so far so good. Yep, All right. Next, this assert internal type, array, result, data. And let's also ensure the array has the key hypocorisms, result, data. All right. Now, this assert internal type array, we expect the hypocorisms to be returned as an array. And this assert empty, result, data, hypocorisms. Okay, all good? All good. So that seems to work. Can we do something to make this fail? Not really. Well, let's just do assert not empty. Not a proper fail, but I can't think of anything better right now. And back to green. Okay, next up, happy path test. Test returns array with hypocorisms. If match. Okay, let's see. I want to take all this. However, here we are not saying assert empty, but instead we want to ensure it returns a short name. Let's use Robert. That's nice because then it will return Bob amongst others. Assert contains Bob. Result, data, hypocorisms. Okay, and just to be on the safe side, let's also check the returned array does not contain the original first name. Assert not contains robot. Okay. Okay, now these tests ensure the basic behavior of our API. It returns JSON. If it doesn't find a matching name in its database, it returns an empty array. If it does find a match, it returns this data structure. And just to repeat myself here, but I think it's a really good idea to only cover the parts of the API that we are using and not cover everything. We only want the test to break if those parts of the data structure change that we are using. These tests define the boundaries on which we can rely when we write our code that uses the API. Okay, let's implement the API client. And I guess we can build it as a model. Hypocorism API shortens name test. Extends PHP unit framework test case. All right, let's start with test implements the shorten first name interface. This assert instance of shorten first name interface class new hypocorism API shortens name like so. And of course it fails. And well, let's go ahead and create a new directory for the class. And now let's create the class. And let's rerun the test. And of course it fails because the class doesn't implement our interface. Implements shorten first name interface, add method stubs, and we're back to green. Well, let's leave this in place and, well, I wonder what should be the next test. How about testing that the method simply returns the first name if the API doesn't return any matching short names? Test returns specified first name if response does not contain short name. Whew, what a name. Okay, now we need to specify the API return value. And the easiest way to do that is if we use an HTTP client class to access the API, and then we can just mock that and specify any response we want. mock HTTP client equals this get mock. The class name is client interface. That would be this one here. Let's alias that. Okay, a bit more descriptive. Okay, now let's say mock HTTP client method getBody will return an empty string. That isn't JSON, but it also doesn't contain any short names. So that should work. And now we can say this assert same foo is the value of new hypocorisms API shortens name, shorten foo. Well, that fails. Good, because it just returns null. Well, right now all we need is just to return the input argument, and we're back to green. But at the moment we're not even passing in the HTTP client. So let's write one more expectation, so we have to do that. We'll just need to add an expects method call to the mock client. And we're back to red. To make this pass, we somehow have to pass our mock HTTP client into the instance. HTTP client instances are not really injectable because they have a different state depending on which URL they request. So instead, let's inject an HTTP client factory. This get mock client factory, this is it. Disable the constructor. Again, I'm not happy with the class name as it is, so let's alias it well to HTTP client factory. Oops, one too many there. Okay. Method create will return mock HTTP client. And now we can pass that into here. And in our shortened first name implementation, we receive the factory. Let's keep the same aliasing going. Don't really need a type int. Initialize it as a field. And now we can get the HTTP client and do some work with it. HTTP client factory create, HTTP client get body. But we ignore it, we just return the first name, which should make it pass again. But just a second. Oh yeah, of course. We now always need to pass in the factory to the constructor. Up here is where the error happens, but first let's fix the type hinting. I want to get rid of all the warnings in PHP Storm. We also have to inject the factory up here, but this time, just as a dummy, we don't have to stub any method. Oh, it doesn't fit. Let's just shorten that a bit. And now we should be back to green. Yep, all good. So now, response. I wish you could have told me. Okay, let's move on. In the next test, let's check if the API returns a list of hypocorisms, then our class should always return the first entry. Test returns first short name from response. That kind of implies that there are some matches. Now, I don't really want to go ahead and copy all that code. It's a little too long anyway for a test, it's not that readable, so instead let's refactor it a little bit. So first of all, let's make the HTTP client a class property. And let's declare this new property properly. And that gives us a place where we can type hint it, and that would be this. And now we can get rid of this, and I want to move the initialization into a setup method. So this line goes here. What I'm aiming for is I want to extract the custom assertion here. So let's first extract the expected arguments. This foo here is expected. And this foo here is a variable name. First name. Yeah, first name is good. And now let's extract all this into a method assert short name. Now we can inline these again. And for the extracted method, the arguments are string and string. Okay, looks good. Now let's move it up above setup and check everything's still green. Yep, everything is green. Very good. So this makes our previous test also look a lot nicer. Now let's go ahead and write the next one. Let's just take those two lines and modify them. So this time we're going to have our mock HTTP client return a proper JSON encoded response. And the array will contain data and hypocorisms. So now we're mocking part of the response, but only those parts that have been covered by our behavior tests. So these two names are returned by the API, and we expect the first run to be returned from our method. And that should fail. And yes, indeed it does. Now back to our API client, time to write some production code to get back to green. So let's decode the response body to an array. We'll add a bit more error checking later. For now, let's keep it simple. If is array result, return result data hypocorisms 0. And will it work? Yep, okay, very good. Well, this works, and it kind of matches our understanding of the API. However, should it ever change, the code would break really easily. And since it's kind of tied to displaying data to the customer, I'd rather err on the safe side. So let's make this a little bit more robust here. And let's do this by expanding this test. Let's extract the response so we can play through different unexpected responses with a data provider. And in case you're not familiar with data providers, they're a tool to run through the same test multiple times with different input values. The provider method is invalid API response data provider. Oops, no, not a test. That's better. Now we return an array, and the first argument we provide is just an empty string. So that should take care of this case. So far nothing changed, we're still green. But what happens if the response is null? Or false? Still should work since we're checking for an array. Okay, and what happens if we return an empty array? Oh, this breaks, okay. Okay, so JSON decode expects parameter 1 to be a string array given. So that would be a really strange situation, very unlikely to happen, but let's just do this. Okay, we're back to green. So now let's return a JSON encoded result, but an incomplete one. Oh, it fails again, but with undefined index data. Okay, let's expand the check to check not only for an array, but also if the result has the key data. Okay, let's see if we can break it again. What happens if we set data, but data is a string? Oh, and we fail again. Illegal string offset. Yeah, well, let's expand the check. Okay, you get the idea. I'll speed this up a bit. It's actually kind of fun to write, but you don't have to watch every iteration in real time. Okay, hope you enjoyed that. Let's clean up this mess. This huge long line here, let's pull that into a method and call it has hypocorisms. Has hypocorism singular. Okay, that looks nice again. So the input $result would be of type mixed, and now we can add some line breaks to make this look nicer. Okay, looks better. Now our code should be a little less breaky. And we're still green after the refactoring. Good. And with that, we have finished this kata. This episode really was a bit different from the previous ones because what we did isn't really Magento 2 specific. It could be just as well applied to Magento 1 or even non-Magento related work. It's simply an approach to testing API integrations. That is, we create one test that confirms the behavior of the external API, covering only what is needed, and then we can safely mock return values in our test in our actual clients and be sure that if the API changes, we have a breaking test that tells us about it. It also pays to encapsulate all the real interaction with the API in a single class, so not spread it out over the system. Of course, for this very simple case, we have done that and put it directly into our model. But honestly, in real project work, API integrations tend to be a bit more complex. Still, the approach is the same, and it works pretty good. If you have any comments or questions, or just want to discuss this approach, please feel free to leave a comment or ping me on Twitter. I'm always happy to discuss testing related stuff. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for watching. And I almost forgot this. So, what's the last step we always do after a kata? That's right, we delete all the code that we've written and only keep the learning. And with that, it's really a wrap. Thank you for watching. Until next time.